everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear?
But you're moving to the back.
I'm sorry about that, yeah. Is that any better? No, that sounds better. Good morning, my name's Rupert Reid. I'm the Director of Research at Policy Exchange. Thank you for all getting up this morning and joining us here. We've got quite an exciting and interesting panel today. Looking at changing the AI conversation, why we need to refocus on the opportunity and how we achieve public trust. Joining us to discuss this interesting question, which Policy Exchange has touched on in some research, which I'll brandish around, called the Smart State. One of the main things that came out of that report was there are huge opportunities in terms of digital government from the NHS, the policing, criminal justice. But unless the public has trust and confidence, introducing some of these new technologies will be much more difficult. So I'll just do a quick round of introductions. To my far left is Shamus of KPMG, who have kindly enabled us to be here today, so a big thank you to them. We've got Margot James, MP and Minister responsible for digital and creative industries. To my right we have Matt Warman MP, one of Parliament's leading champions of technology, is highly in demand on the subject. And to my far right is Hugh Milward of Microsoft. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask Matt to kick off, do some scene setting, and then we'll move through the panel and then open up to some questions.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. I think the first thing to say about artificial intelligence is that while it sounds scary and something that most of my constituents would tell me that they don't understand and they don't know if they necessarily like it, the reality is that we're already having this conversation too late, and I don't mean that 9:30 is preferable to 8 o'clock for a fringe, but I do mean that this is a conversation that has already been going on and we already should have been having for a number of years. And there are two difficulties with it. I think part of it is that this is an agenda that is going to happen anyway, and where we have, from a public sector point of view, I think a duty to seize every single one of those opportunities. So, for instance, organisations like Big Brother Watch are getting very het up about the fact that the Metropolitan Police is trialling automatic facial recognition within CCTV. Now, it's a really good, to my mind, interesting and worthwhile example of how AI and straightforward technology can make a huge difference. And yet, there hasn't been a public policy conversation. There hasn't been a debate around, is that the right thing to do? How should technology change that sort of area of whether it's policing or whether it's the public sector more generally? So what we need, perversely, is to play catch-up in an area where the most important thing we need is transparency, and yet its defining characteristic is its cleverness and its complexity. So we need to be far more open with the public about something while simultaneously saying it's going to be very, very hard to make it comprehensible and easy. Now, the even worse news is that the organisations that have that conversation are organisations like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, which, with the best will in the world, are not necessarily top of the public's trust barometer, or the government, which is even lower down the public's trust barometer. So we are not starting from a terribly positive place. But the thing that I would say, just to conclude this sort of brief introduction, is that actually what we have to be guided by, and what the government has already sought to be guided by, is to try and get away from that inherent complexity in this subject and to say, what are the fundamental principles behind which we have based, or on which rather we have based an awful lot of the decisions that we've made around the public sector in the past, and how do we carry those over into a digital world? Because the idea of the police, if you use the facial recognition example, the idea of the police keeping an eye on what a crowd is doing at a football match is not actually any different, whether it is digital or whether it is as many police officers standing on the metaphorical bridge keeping an eye on that crowd in person. So I think we need to be wary of saying that this is a fundamental shift of opportunity, but we also need to understand that the change of pace and scale will have ramifications that we couldn't necessarily easily predict or understand. So I think what we need to do, as I say, is stick to those principles that allow us to say, what is it that it is fundamentally right for the state to do when it is grasping those opportunities? And crucially, what is it right for the state to seek to limit the private sector from doing when it comes to those opportunities as well? Because to my mind, the risk of being moderately controversial, Cambridge Analytica was targeting people in a extremely focused way as a core part of its business. But targeted advertising is not fundamentally different from buying an advert in Auto Express rather than the Telegraph if you want to sell a car. So we should be careful about pretending that the game has changed fundamentally, while also having an eye on what that new scenario actually looks like when it comes to real people's aspirations and expectations. So having set a scene that says it's really difficult and really complicated, I'm going to hand over to someone who is not a politician, which it means that they don't have to make the decision. So in that sense, I'm avoiding all possible responsibility. And then eventually we'll get to Margot. So that leaves us there. Thank you very much, Rupert.
Thank you very much indeed, man. We'll hand over to the head of digital disruption at KPMG, Shamus.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. And Matt, it was great to hear your kind of kick-off. And it's interesting, we did a poll of 2,000 people up and down the UK looking at trust, which is, there's a white paper at the back which has all the polling data. And actually, government has 22% of people trust the government with this data, 8% to the big internet companies. But the NHS is, in fact, the only organisation which is above 50%. And it's 56%, I think, from memory. But if you look across the world, what's really interesting is private health isn't trusted as much as public health as well. So we are in a unique position in the UK. So from my viewpoint, and I give a lot of talks around the world on the future of AI and the future of jobs, etc. And I am fundamentally bored of the dystopian utopian argument, right? Are we all going to lose our jobs? Well, that headline was in the New York Times in 1957, talking about artificial intelligence. So it's been around for a long time. And I do think this time is different, I do. But if we spend our time arguing about dystopia and utopia, we're going to end up in dystopia, right? So what we need to do is focus and be proactive to go for utopia. Now, from a UK point of view, we are number 4 in the world in AI. And you can measure that in different ways, right? Both in terms of money spent on AI, but also research papers being done. So number 4 is not bad. You know, China's above us. They've got 10,000 people doing PhDs in artificial intelligence. But we've got some great heritage, right? So Professor Hinton, who's the godfather of AI, was obviously a British person, now in Toronto because we didn't love him enough. And he wrote his paper in 1972 on deep learning, which is what all of our phones now use for searching photographs, etc., etc. So how do we go from number 4 and go up to number 3 or number 2 or number 1? Well, I actually don't think we're ever going to be number 1 at AI research just because we won't have the access to data that the Chinese consumer has willingly given up to their government and to their research people. That was humour, by the way. But I do believe that we can be number 1 if we apply AI into industry in the right way. And the perfect place to do that has got to be in health. So can we be number 1 in health AI and health technology in the world? Yes, we can. And we've got a cradle-to-grave health system, and we've got a bunch of consumers out there who actually trust the NHS more than any other organisation in the country. So we've got a perfect triangle, if you like, with great researchers, a great health system, and consumers of that health system who trust the NHS. But what we can't do is we can't ignore and play on the trust of those consumers of health by just giving that data away to one of the big internet companies. Microsoft I love, by the way, so that's fine. But we've given away our health data already to one organisation, and they're going to do some brilliant things with it, and they're going to create some great algorithms, and we get free access for 5 years, right? But I think actually we should be opening this up to an ecosystem of small organisations up and down the country to give them access to data. We should be doing that through the digital hubs which are being suggested, and create data hubs which go with that. That's the number 1 thing we should do. Number 2, we should get both government and companies like KPMG and independent research organizations to start changing the tone of the conversation. We do need to be proactive about jobs. We do need to be worried about creating new organizations which do governance and risk. But we need to change the tone of conversation away from job losses to this is a major opportunity for the UK. And actually, without doing that, we won't get the right engagement from people. So if we can get the data and we can change the tone of the conversation and we can get the data zones created up and down the country so it's not a London-Cambridge economic answer, but a countrywide economic answer, then we've got a real opportunity to create a whole ecosystem of AI startups in the health space. And I think that's where we should focus going forward. So that's my opinion. Slightly out there, but we should be number one in the world in health.
Great, totally.
Hugh. Be quite a lot of agreement around this table, actually. So, I mean, I think the opportunity is also in health. You take from what you've said about the high levels of trust in the NHS. So that is trust in the NHS, not in the way that the NHS handles our data. Because let's be absolutely clear about the way the NHS handles our data. It's in little paper envelopes that get moved around hospitals on trolleys and then left in corridors. So this is not high levels of data security. But what we do have is this incredible trust in the NHS as an institution. And that's something that provides us with an amazing opportunity. Because one, you've got a need. You get this coalescence of several things happening at the same time. You have a real need to be able to transform the way in which we think about technology and health. We need to get more out of less. We need to be able to augment radiologists and surgeons and specialists across the NHS so that they can have insights that they wouldn't be able to naturally get from the inputs that they have easy access to. So you have this need. You've got the technology that is at the cusp of having real breakthroughs in this space. So the ability to decode some of the most problematic diseases that we have. We've talked in the past, unfortunately, actually, about solving cancer as opposed to curing cancer because you're applying data science and effectively using a neural network in the same way that you might be able to reverse engineer it. But we are at the cusp of some really interesting breakthroughs in this space. So you've got this technology, leading edge technology that gives you the ability. You've got the demand in the fact that we can do incredible things. But at the same time, you've got this fear. And the fear is about what could happen. It is this dystopian, this element. And actually, we are a long way from generalized AI. We are a long way from a fundamental shift. We are faster and faster incremental changes in what we are able to do. But there is this fear, the fear about whether it's going to take our jobs, about whether it's going to be treated effectively, whether the data is safe, how it could be leveraged by organizations that are working against our interests. And that is a very real fear. And as a technology industry, if we just ignore that and pretend everything is all right, we are on a hiding to nothing. If we don't drive trust across the population in the technology they're using, then people won't use it. This is existential for the technology industry. So we have to drive that high levels of trust. So I think there are potentially two solutions to this. The first is a set of ethical principles under which technology will develop, that data will be treated. We've put out 6 principles, but there are others, and who's to say that ours are right? And actually, the level of trust in technology companies, maybe ours are wrong. But it's forums like this and debates such as this that will really drive the changes that we need to see and the coalescence around what the right principles are. We've set out 6. Fairness is the first. So you think about the way that
you can introduce bias into decision making. We want to find ways of ironing that out as much as possible. Facial recognition has often been used as the kind of case study for poor levels of bias, in the fact that until quite recently, it was very, very bad at recognizing anything other than white and male faces, for example. So we've got to have a principle that we push for fairness as much as possible. Reliability and safety is the second one. No one wants to get into a self-driving car that is neither reliable nor safe. If we don't have high levels of reliability and safety across AI, then again, you damage trust. The third is privacy and security. Now, we've made big changes with GDPR. It is, like it or not, the EU is the only game in town when it comes to major regulation in this space. The White House is nowhere. It's completely dysfunctional at the moment. And so GDPR has actually moved a long way to giving that reassurance that we hope that society will have in the way that data is treated. But it is a fundamental, and it's not just privacy, it's also security, which means that we all have to have extremely high levels of cyber resilience and awareness. The fourth is inclusiveness. We can't drive trust in technology if we leave whole segments of the population behind. We have to be inclusive in the way that we work. We have to carry everyone with us, and that includes those who are currently marginalized in a variety of ways from the mainstream through disability or other means. We have to carry everyone. The fifth and the sixth are kind of fundamental principles of transparency and accountability. And actually, if you look at an algorithm, it's fairly straightforward to have a level of transparency about an algorithm. But a deep neural network, there is no real transparency that you can have. So we have to design systems that will allow the transparency. So, for example, design an additional piece of AI that interrogates the neural network in order to derive a kind of consistent meaning from the decisions that it's making. So that's what I mean by that level of transparency. And accountability. You know, very often AI is seen to be completely unaccountable, but this is a solvable solution. We've managed it with a car. If a bolt shears in a car when you're driving it, we all know who is accountable. We have worked this out. Even though there are hundreds of manufacturers, there are hundreds of different parts of the supply chain before it gets to you, we've worked out that level of accountability, and we can do this with AI. So those are the real fundamentals. And the second, so we've got ethics as the first. The second is skills. And it's about how do we future-proof ourselves as a nation. It's about how do we engage with the technology so that we understand, so that it's not done to us, it's done with us. And that is an absolute fundamental. That means not just computer science and ICT type technologies. It also means those uniquely human skills that allow us to do the things that humans do better than technology. And that's around empathy, that's around emotional intelligence, and that's around critical thinking. So if we can do that, I think we're in a really good place around the development of AI.
Great. Good.
Quite a landscape of the future to pick through for you, Minister.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a fascinating part of my brief. It forms a sort of one of the main strands which we call emerging technologies. The others being quantum computing, IoT, Internet of Things, blockchain, and AI. AI and Internet of Things being very, very closely linked. And a sort of brother, sister of AI is obviously data. And one of the reasons why things are racing ahead, sometimes it feels slightly ahead of us, is the huge change in data in terms of advances in data storage capacity, advances in processing speeds, analytics. I love to work in the House of Commons Library. It's absolutely vast. It's almost like a third of the length of Parliament and floor to ceiling with books. And it is strange, really, to think that with the machine learning techniques now available, all the data held in that library could really be read and analysed, insights gained in a matter of minutes. So we as humans can't compete with that. But I think what AI does is present us with many, many other opportunities. As Matt said, I mean, and also actually Shamus pointed out how long ago this issue started getting discussed, and it is rather funny that we're now seeing it in the media as if it is a new thing. I mean, we've been carrying around AI in our pockets with our mobiles for goodness knows how long now. And every time there's a software update, it's capable of something else remarkable. Not always considered good by the users, but I think it either surprises and delights or annoys. But over time, we can see how quickly some of these revolutions are going to take place. GDPR has been mentioned. I very much liked the principles that Hugh outlined. It's very much the way that we're thinking. I'll come on to talking a little bit about what we're doing with those principles at the moment, but very much in line with what we're trying to do in government. So I was pleased to hear you say that. GDPR, indeed, absolutely true. The American companies are complying with GDPR. Otherwise, they can't sell into the European Union, can't transfer data into the European Union. So GDPR is the standard that I think the world will come to accept. And it is very satisfying when you go into it, because I took the bill through Parliament, the new Data Protection Bill earlier this year, and when you go into it in detail, it's quite gratifying to find that our own Information Commissioner, who's based up in Manchester, was basically responsible for a good half of the total GDPR that is now being implemented across Europe. Another example of British influence being effective. So much has been written about the effect on employment of technology in general, robotics, but AI as well. I want to pick up on some of the health discussion because I think that the effect on employment in the health service will be incredibly positive. I think it will boost productivity. The vast amount of data at the NHS's disposal, going back to the 1950s, is the reason why we will undoubtedly be world leaders in AI and health, as long as certain conditions are met, which I'll come back to. But it's already happening. I mean, there's a joint venture between Moorfields Eye Hospital and one of the deep data companies that is now responsible for diagnostics for glaucoma becoming more accurate and far swifter than ever an eye surgeon or ophthalmologist could repeat. So that's already happening. There are other JVs elsewhere in the health service with the hospitals in Oxford Trust have entered into a joint venture with one of the DeepMind companies. So it's already happening, and this will liberate consultants and surgeons who, let's not forget, take about 10 years to train, if not longer, to perform, more interesting work, more surgery, and of course the fantastic AI in what can be done surgically now in a virtual sense, in terms of deploying mixed realities to be able to perform surgery remotely. Think of what that will do for overseas aid policy. It is absolutely fantastic what can be done. The constraints, obviously the ethics issue, and I was really delighted to hear from Shamus that the public trusts the NHS with their data more than anyone else. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that the public trusts the NHS to share that data. That is another matter. So there's so much to unpick in this area. It's absolutely fascinating. But as long as the principles are set down in the way that Hugh mentioned in his talk, which give the NHS the absolute guidance it will need in order to share that data with a company that is going to improve treatment, care, diagnosis and management of millions of patients all over the world in the end, then I have no doubt that we will achieve this. The NHS has its own data guardian. So Jeremy Hunt, when he was Secretary of State, had a lot of foresight. He established this Office of the NHS Data Guardian to inform the debate within the NHS and set out principles. So that's a good thing. The other great thing is the appointment of my predecessor, Matt Hancock, as Secretary of State for Health, because, of course, Matt really knows, understands technology and is very, very passionate that the NHS will not be left behind in all this. And it's absolutely crucial for patients, for people's healthcare, that they're not. Just very quickly, what's the government doing? At the moment, we're in the process of establishing the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. The chair has already been appointed. We're in the process of appointing the board at the moment. It will be up and running by the end of the year. We consulted earlier in the year about its remit, and I think that the sort of principles you've heard this morning will be very much guiding its work. And it will be there to really strengthen and improve the way data is used. It'll be deployed to look at the sort of AI-driven innovation, and let's not forget innovation is in its title, in order to maximise benefits to society. And it will take the lead on advising on any regulatory change that we need to introduce. We're also establishing the AI Council, and that is really a forum for collaboration between government and industry, and that will be obviously informed by the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And that will, identify sort of barriers to growth, opportunities for growth, and that sort of thing, more from a AI industry standpoint. So we'll be welcoming Microsoft and other industry partners to that process. It's fundamental. I'm pleased to see someone's left, I think it must be KPMG, the industrial strategy summary on your chairs, hopefully. Yeah. AI is fundamental to the industrial strategy, as is all emerging technology, really, in many ways. The skills issue we're addressing through 200 new AI master's places. We'll also be working over the next few years on, and by 2025, we want to have at least 1,000 government-financed PhD places in AI. We are very determined to become one of the world leaders in AI. And the overall sector deal that is part of the industrial strategy for AI has funding of very nearly £1 billion behind it, made up of government funding and industry funding. So that is the grand challenges. Anybody who is aware of more of the detail of the industrial strategy will know that, as well as sector deals with many of the industrial sectors, we've also identified some grand challenges, the ageing society, big things that much of UK industrial strategy will have to address. And one of them is AI and data grand challenge. And the huge review that we did as part of the development of this part of the industrial strategy was called Growing the Artificial Intelligence Industry in the UK. So that's absolutely key. And one of the first AI missions coming out of that will be, or is actually, because it's already started, the early diagnosis and treatment of chronic illnesses. There is an estimate from the experts that AI properly deployed in healthcare could save 22,000 deaths from cancer per year. Think what it could do in many of the other disease areas as well. So it's a question of taking a leap, but an informed leap, and a leap that is governed with an ethical framework underpinning it. And I'm very excited about the future, for the public, for us as citizens. The benefits it can bring are enormous, but obviously there is a lot to get through before we can really be enjoying them in sort of 10 years' time. Thank you very much.
Thanks to the Minister for that tour de force of government activity. We've now got some time for some questions. In asking them, I will take them in three. Just ask the panellists to think that when we reconvene here in 12 months' time, what one thing should government should have achieved, and what one thing should business have achieved to try and further this agenda? So if you can try and weave that into your answers, that would be interesting. Right, so I'll take three questions to begin with. Gentleman here. Just name an organisation.
Nicholas Beale from SciTep. Does the panel think that the fact that the UK is America's closest ally and probably China's best friend in the West gives us a unique opportunity to collaborate with these two leaders in AI, so that instead of being in direct competition, we can do something which is more than the sum of the parts?
Lady at the front here.
Thank you. Jenny Hollinsby from Folkestone and Hythe District Council. I mean, I'm all for this, and I think it's great, and we can get some real good opportunities and benefits out of it. But I still think, being a member of the patients panel locally, that it's going to be extremely difficult to lose the fear that local residents have. And I think that's going to be one of the major issues. One thing, I think some time ago there was the opportunity to share data with the local hospital, and patients could opt in or opt out, and the majority opted out.
And gentleman at the back there. We'll come over that side of the room in a while.
Thank you. Chris Francis, SAP. In terms of focusing on the opportunity of AI, as with many other things Margot mentioned, blockchain and analytics, depends on data and digital processes. Yet the UK actually, in terms of business to business and business adoption, leaving aside the wonderful success in B2C and in consumer adoption, is actually well down the bottom of the benchmarks in adoption of. So what can we do about the digital foundation and ensuring that in the work and connected issues such as productivity, we have built the foundation to seize the opportunity?
Okay, thank you. So we've got China's relationship with the US, and what can the UK do as a sort of a linchpin or convener? Local fear and willingness to share data, and the last question on productivity. Any takers? Hugh?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Nicholas, the collaboration with China, I think what's incredibly hard about around this is that you've got an ethical base that comes from two different parts of the philosophical world. And at the moment we're finding, so certainly within Microsoft, we are finding that bridging the two is incredibly challenging. We accept levels of, the Chinese government is willing to put its own people under levels of surveillance and management through technology that we are uncomfortable with, unhappy with. We wouldn't accept. And as we set out a set of ethical principles based on a kind of Western philosophy rather than a Confucian philosophy, we're effectively setting out a set of standards against which we're measuring, the right or the wrong way to take technology, and that's difficult because ethics are, after all, relative rather than absolute. And so what we would say is ethically sound or unsound, in China they have a very different view as to whether that's sound or unsound. At the moment we are in a situation where we will say no to certain deployments of technology. Simple as that. We will not support customers who want to pay for certain deployments of technology because we think it is ethically unsound. That is not to say that Chinese companies will make the same decision. So you will get an asymmetrical development of technology where you will get Chinese companies or companies in China or Chinese government taking technology development into places that we are uncomfortable doing so. And in that asymmetry, then finding a way in which to collaborate is incredibly hard. So it is a growing challenge, because you are going to get data sets in China where people's rights over the privacy of their data is completely ignored, which we would not accept over here. So it is a growing challenge because you're going to get very strong AI developing in China that we in the West won't benefit from. It is a growing challenge, and at the moment we're not quite sure how we're going to deal with it, if I'm absolutely honest.
Can I add something?
Yeah, Shamus.
I absolutely understand the point because there's a great well of data over there and lots of researchers. But also going back to something Margot said earlier on, which was, doesn't just the fact that people want to share data with the NHS doesn't mean they want to share it with other people. And I suspect China would be a step too far, quite frankly. And I think this is about earning and respecting and keeping the trust of the owners, the real owners of the data. We are obviously doing it with the US already, right? The DeepMind Moorfield deal is there already. My argument is slightly different. I'm okay with the DeepMind Moorfield thing, but why do we allow small UK organisations up and down the country to do AI research on that data before we start giving it to an American company, right? So can we start in the UK? And absolutely we should be doing DeepMind. DeepMind is one of the best companies, research companies, and they are UK based, right? But they're owned by Google. But let's spread the economic benefit. Let's spread the talent within the UK first. And in terms of trust, I do think large organisations like KPMG and Microsoft and others and government need to be working to change the tone of the conversation and build up using the values which have been described earlier on. So I think we need to do that proactively. We need to do that now. We need to take responsibility to do that, I think. And in terms of the question, SAP question at the back, well, I think there's a whole load of work to do around infrastructure. I think common data models is a major step forward. You guys have announced with Microsoft last week a common data model for finance. Microsoft got one for health already. I think there's a whole load of work we can do around infrastructure, common data models, etc., which will standardize data in ways which we can then start utilizing. So I don't step away. I'm not demeaning the size of the task, and that needs proactive management. But it's nice to see some of the work starting to happen. Snappy all three.
Very good. So, Matt, did that do from China to Folkestone?
Yeah. I sort of think clearly Hugh's point about collaboration is right. But I think when you look at the British opportunities, then actually there is a genuine case for why we should be able to lead the world, and it would be China seeking to collaborate with us. That is an opportunity that I think not only allows us to, and I'm always sort of slightly nervous about talking about sharing British values around the world, but it is an opportunity for us to say, well, this is what we're prepared to do, rather than be told this is what you have to do in order to make some progress. So I think there is a potential for a virtuous circle on some of that. Just to slightly challenge your point, Shamus, though I do have some reservations about, in principle, I don't care where a company is based if it's helping the health service. And I think we need to be very careful about saying, let's try for preference to work with British companies rather than US companies or whatever. And I know that's not quite
opportunity
what you're
was what I was going for.
And I think what we need to be able to do when it comes to the data around the health service is to develop an appropriate platform that allows anyone to do whatever interesting stuff it is. And if that's a company from wherever that says, here's how we save more lives and help people live longer, then we need to find a way of embracing that in a sensible way. And we need to find a way of avoiding a conversation that says this is American companies running the NHS, because it isn't. It's the British NHS deriving benefit from what is inevitably a more globalised system than we've ever had before. And just finally on the trust thing, I think the more research there is on this, the more it seems to be the case that if it is properly explained to people, then they embrace it with both hands. And I think actually the challenge around a lot of the health service data stuff is there is some stuff where people think that it happens already. The idea that you get referred to a consultant by your GP, and that consultant doesn't immediately know what drugs your GP has prescribed you, is something that is sort of terrifying and nonsensical to most people, and yet that is the world that we live in. So I think if you say to people, this is we call it data sharing, we call it whatever, actually this is your GP now being able to tell your consultant something, it's kind of obvious. And so I think there are some things where we perhaps need to be better at gathering people's consent in a way that aligns with their expectations, rather than says, here's an imaginary blank piece of paper, do you agree to something that you think should already be happening anyway? So I think there's an awful lot of confusion that, again, is solved by transparency, but some of it is, for me, is in the just do it category, rather than, and I don't mean without consent, but it is sort of, we should be aware of what it is people think we're already doing, and how do we make sure we then get to where they think they already are.
Minister.
Right. Just to add a few points to what's already been said on the China-America issue, I do agree with everything that's been said on China, really. Yes, they are. We have a good relationship with China. They're a very, very important market for us, etc. But there are well-founded concerns over intellectual property, quite apart from the other things that we heard from Hugh. On America, of course, the DeepMind company was a British company, a huge success story. It was then acquired by Google. So in a sense, it is a British company. And the only thing I would say to what's been said on the sharing of data with companies, wherever they are in the world, is that we need to make sure that the NHS and the British taxpayer gets a return on the investment that has been made for decades in the development of this huge database. You know, apart from developing countries, I see no reason why we shouldn't expect a sort of system of royalties when those algorithms are then used to improve patient care around the world. So we've got to be smart and savvy on the financial front. In terms of the lady here from Folkestone, struck fear into my heart. I can get a bit carried away with all this sometimes, but of course the whole opt-in, opt-out, I've seen that in other parts of the country where people don't want their data shared within the NHS. It's a bit like organ donation. I think we've just got to work on it, really. There's a remarkably high number of people consent to their organs being used after their death. And it's a similar thing, really. You're sharing your data in very, very controlled circumstances, completely anonymised, for the benefit not just of the public good, but also to your own family. Your children and your grandchildren will be the direct beneficiaries of the decision. So I think it's a process of education that we need to embark upon. On digital and data adoption, I quite agree. It's a big challenge to get the fantastic technological advances that we're now capable of adopted by business particularly. And to that end, I noticed that Jürgen Meyer, who is the Chief Executive of Siemens in the UK, and on the Industrial Strategy Board at the Business Department, he has just launched last week a system and resource-based operation to drive a technological adoption throughout industry. And I think it's going to be piloted. The measures that they've got are going to be piloted in the Northwest with a budget of £20 million for the pilot. We're very conscious that we've got to bring industry with us. And the government sponsor a number of pilots, you know, for example, around the adoption of 5G, which is going to enable the Internet of Things, which is totally reliant on data and AI, really. At the moment, we've got test beds and pilots all over the country, testing applications. And the latest one, the biggest one, has just been announced last month across the West Midlands, from Wolverhampton through Birmingham to Coventry. That's going to be a whole 5G test bed area, up to £50 million of public money going into it. So I think government have to partner with industry, I think, to test some of these applications, and then we need to force the pace of change and ensure the adoption, which we are trying to do through the industrial strategy as well. It's a very good point.
Can I just add one more point on briefly? Just very briefly. So on the Folkestone point, I do think that there are different ways in which people understand where value is derived from the data. And I think that fundamentally, if the population believes that the technology companies are getting their hands on the data in order to serve their own aims, to advertise against it, to connect that data to other data sets they've got and to derive their own commercial value from it, then we will absolutely lose the trust of everyone. But if we can make the case, which we have to make, that this is not in the interest of the technology companies, it is in the interest of the patient and those who are receiving care, and that the technology companies are paid for the work that they do in supporting the patient in exactly the same way as any other provider, then I think we can start rebuilding that level of trust around the way that that data is used.
And the polling in here actually says exactly that. Even the people who said, I don't want to share my data, if you go, well, it's going to improve diagnosis or it's going to improve the NHS process, they flip. So it's exactly right.
Something to take back to Folkestone. Thank you. We'll take a few more questions and then also a reminder to the panellists, what's the one thing that in 12 months' time should have been done either by government or business to advance this? Lady here?
My background is general
It's a
practice.
microphone.
Oh, sorry, yeah, thank you. I'm a GP, and what I would like to think is that AI can be harnessed to make sure that I spend more time with the patient, less time on bureaucracy. And I'd also say, are you aware how dreadful the current data is within the NHS? Because it's been collected by people like me who are trying to see a patient in 10 minutes and actually has to spend about 4 minutes on the computer filling up templates to aid me with diagnosis.
Multiple templates.
Multiple templates. And I have a daughter who is a junior doctor in a hospital which requires them to master 5 computer systems on the first day that they start their job. That's Gloucester. I want you to know really that if you were thinking about using the NHS as your laboratory and your test site for fantastic AI products to sell to the world, you must realise the limitations of that laboratory. Otherwise, you could be hampered, terribly misled in your research.
That's a good point, isn't it? Very good point.
There's a hand up there, lady, at the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Carmen Benitez, and I run a technology company. And I want to, thank the panel, especially Shamus and Margot, on what government is doing, because I'm personally politically neutral. I'm an American, and I actually came here to develop a blockchain and AI business because of the deep mind and because of the level of AI here. So I think it's really important that we continue facilitating that movement of people here to the UK for the purpose of building, the gold standard in AI and in these different types of technologies that are emerging. Number one, because of common law and what happens with common law as that spreads in different jurisdictions. So I think, post-Brexit, this is a great. So thank you for pushing that. But my other point, which is a totally separate.
I sense a question coming
It
on.
is. It's a totally point. It revolves around something that has not been discussed yet, which is you have a bias oftentimes in AI. And you were talking, Hugh, earlier about, well, we have AI on top of AI, but our operating systems as people are actually changing to the point where we are reliant as a trust factor to that. But if we're trying to create trust and there's errors in those AI systems, even with AI on top of AI, how do we as people manage to say, hey, number one, how do we manage that on the companies that are developing this to say, hey, there is an error, and what about the inundation of those errors that will that will happen because of it? And how do we deal with that inundation of errors in the system?
Thank you. And scamper around here, gentlemen. Charlotte.
Stuart Holland from Equifax. So we're using AI in financial services for lenders to hopefully improve financial inclusion, make fewer bad loans, and in a way which is explainable to regulators. Please don't ask me how we do that. So my question was really about kind of good and bad practice you see among regulators in the UK and globally, which is maybe you would like to see to kind of maximize the impact of AI. And for Margot, I guess maybe a slightly different question. Do you see a role for the UK kind of shaping that global regulatory environment to maximize the benefits for UK firms?
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It speaks to the quality of the Policy Exchange audience, even at this time where we have a GP and an American entrepreneur. And I'll throw it open to
Shall I go first? Okay. So I absolutely agree on the data point, and I know a neonatologist, and he was talking to me about the fact that these machines which are looking after premature babies aren't connected up to the LAN because they're worried about cyber attacks. And so at the end of the day, somebody has to take the data, read it, go to another machine and type it in, and therefore you get all the error of that as well. You know what? It'd be great if you know, we're going to do stuff around image scanning and images, etc. That's a no-brainer. Let's get AI working on both efficiency in terms of process as well as diagnosis, right? And I think they're different. So I actually think we should be really cognizant of exactly what you said, but this should be making, as Margot said, this is a great opportunity, not only for saving lives, but driving productivity into the NHS. So let's do that in the right way. And I think we could all stumble along with our great excitement and miss that completely. I really do, actually. And I come from a long line of headmasters and doctors, so I think I'm put on my place on a regular basis. In terms of AI on top of AI, I think that's a major risk. And we're doing a lot of work in our internal audit function, working with companies to think about the new governance structures which need to go around that. Because actually, most governance structures in corporates are kind of just you sign off the system and you're done with it. And now these systems develop over time. And how do you make sure that the rejected data, the errors, are used for retraining, but in a controlled way? So there's a whole piece of work going on across different companies, and we're part of that, looking at that. So I don't think that's solved. But it's something which is emerging. And in terms of which regulator, well, I think all the regulators are in catch-up mode. But I was in Ukraine last week working with the Ukrainian government around what they could do. And they're looking at Estonia and going, we want to be Estonia, right? Because they've got the great branding and they're doing things. But they genuinely felt that there was going to be, from discussion to policy action, felt quicker in a smaller, more agile. I mean, you know, they probably care less. They probably, you know, I mean, you know, to be honest. But so I just think this needs speed, and just to kind of, because Matt mentioned it, that I do, by the way, completely agree about it's all about the outcomes and the health. But I just, the reason I'm obsessed about the UK is not because we should have any disadvantage in terms of access, but let's create a platform which we do have access. This is a great economic opportunity. Forget about the NHS outcomes, which are brilliant. This is about driving economic growth in terms of new companies, startups in the UK. That's the bit I was trying to unlock, and I confused the two things. I apologise.
Yeah, my wife's a doctor, and the fact that sort of one of the 5 bits of technology she has to use still includes the fax machine is somewhat terrifying. But I do think at the same time, what we've historically been bad at and got worse at in some ways is putting the N in the NHS. We haven't said all. I appreciate surgeries are typically private businesses, but we haven't said here is the common platform that you have to use that allows the enormous data set to be created. So while we talk in theory about the NHS having some sort of fantasy enormous warehouse of data, in reality we have a whole load of different ones, some of which talk to each other and some of which may or may not end up being of any use. So I think we're absolutely right, I think, to talk in terms of actually the initial deals will not be with the health service, they'll be with Moorfields or they'll be with whatever. So I think it's about where can you first identify what's relatively low-hanging fruit and say, here is a data set that is coherent and you don't have to spend the first 3 years tidying it up. So I think you're absolutely right, but we need to make sure that where we do the inevitable NHS IT, whether you want to call it program, but that always sounds a bit scary. Where we improve NHS use of technology, we do it in such a way that it is as amenable as possible to this kind of stuff. So I appreciate that it's sort of spinning 2 separate plates, but I think it's, in a sense, the only option. I think on coding in bias, then actually, where I think we're going to end up is simply around a much franker conversation that technology is built by people and people make mistakes and therefore technology makes mistakes, and that's why we'll just need appropriate sanctions within that, but also a much more honest conversation that says, yes, there will come a point where, just as we've already had the first death through a driverless car, we will have some really serious consequences of algorithms being inadvertently not ending up where we would like them to go. I think that's an argument for a really strong regulation regulatory framework and all of that stuff, and for a really honest conversation with the public. The worst case scenario for me, in a sense, would be to pretend that at some point we will be building an infallible computer, because actually that's where we will end up with completely losing everybody's trust.
Yeah, and in common, in many respects, there's no more biased decision maker than a human being. We are full of bias, and not only that, actually it's very difficult to detect the bias in many respects. Having said that, we still think that as we develop technology, at least for the time being, we have to find ways of keeping humans in the loop in terms of that check, that feedback. So yes, more work to do, but humans need to stay part of it, biased though they and flawed though they may be. We just need to be much more cognizant of what that bias looks like in our daily lives, in the way that we're working. And there's a lot of work that companies like ours are doing around how do you identify unconscious bias, and so to bring that into the way that we make decisions is incredibly important. I'm not going to say anything else about the NHS except that we're working on a super project with Great Ormond Street. And we have been absolutely horrified by what we've found in terms of the technology. So you mentioned that your daughter's, it was your systems or your daughter's system where you have to input into several tools at the same time. It's what we found is it's even worse than that, because what happens is that because the process of logging off and logging on again takes so long, that they actually just leave the systems on. And so you walk down a corridor at Great Warman Street and all the systems are on with access to all the data that's on it, because the process of closing it down and logging on again is just too hard. So there is a massive simplification required to try to work out, well, what data are we really collecting? Can we fill in a form once and for that form to be used many times? And that also then gets us away from the incredibly dirty data that we get from the NHS. It takes years and years to clean up the data so that it can be used to try and help with diagnostics. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it needs to start at fundamentals around simplification.
Well, thank you. Actually, Hugh's just blown out of the water one of the things I was going to say. I think. only because I was going to say that really sanitary point that you made about data in the NHS, and I was thinking, well, rather than just sort of rely on GP data, we should be looking at the data emanating from centres of excellence. And you can't really argue that Great Ormond Street Hospital is not a centre of excellence in paediatrics. So problems, obviously, even at centres of excellence. There's all sorts of, there's lots of other rich health sources of data, I suppose, with clinical trials where data is collected in a more systematic way, epidemiological studies and so on. But it does underline the need to clean up the data before it is actually deployed in this new setting. On AI, being built on AI, that's an interesting way of looking at it. It made me think, really, that AI is something that sounds quite scary. But if you look at the history of it, once an element of AI becomes part of people's day-to-day currency, it starts being called something else. So, music streaming, Spotify and all of that, that isn't music AI, that it is AI in music, but we call it streaming. It sounds much more friendly, doesn't it? Facial recognition sounds much more friendly. These things start getting names to describe the benefit, and that way people are then comfortable and they forget it's AI. In terms of the regulatory issue that was raised, and I'm very interested to hear what you're doing using AI in enabling people to access finance. That's absolutely brilliant. I think that, our vision for the Centre of Data Ethics and Innovation is for it to become an independent body by statute in a couple of years' time. It's got a resource of, I think it's £9 million for the next 3 years. I want it to really be seen in the end, admired around the world like NICE is, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which was established by Frank Dobson in about 1998, 99. And it's really stood the test of time, and it is world renowned, and I hope that we will achieve that sort of leadership, that thought leadership in terms of the regulatory setting as we develop our AI capabilities. So yeah, we've got a big vision for it, and I'm sure that we can. We've got the basis. We've got huge investments have already been made in this country. We've got some of the best universities, some of the best companies, and I'm very excited about the future. But yeah, it would be great for the UK to be in a thought-leading role, respected across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. We are bang on time. Very quickly, in 10 seconds, each panellist can choose one of those things. What one thing in 12 months can the audience hold you accountable for? You'd like to see?
So I would like business to have perfected, or got closer to perfected, homomorphic encryption, which allows you to interrogate big data sets while that data set is encrypted, which means that you have much, much higher level of security for the data that's being used.
I would like to see the Centre for Data Ethics having a coherent and frank conversation with the public.
Well, I certainly want to bring about what Matt wants. Definitely, that is the purpose of it. My other hope is that in a year's time, my constituents would actually understand what Hugh just said.
From my point of view, I don't think it's just a government job to change the tone of the conversation. I think there should be industry, government, academia working together. And I think this time next year, it'd be great to be doing the same poll, which we did this year, and have a different view about AI and trust. And people want to be proactive about wanting to have their data as part of the benefit to the NHS. So I think the big companies and academia need to stand up as well.
Well, that's wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you in 12 months' time to check up on all that.
Thanks very much. It was a really interesting meeting. It was so useful. Yeah, it was so useful for me to